New York City, 1996. There is a woman walking down a street in Soho. She is tall, nearly 5'11", with platinum blonde hair cut close to her face, and the kind of posture that people who were raised well carry through their whole lives, whether they want to or not. She is walking fast, not running. Fast. The walk of someone who knows exactly where they're going and is determined to get there before the world notices them doing it. She is wearing something simple: dark trousers, a long coat. Nothing that announces itself. Nothing that says, "Look at me." Carolyn Bessette understood instinctively that simplicity on the right body is louder than anything else. She dressed to disappear and ended up more visible than anyone. She knows the cameras are there. They're always there now. 30 men, sometimes more, with telephoto lenses, and the particular patience of people who are paid to wait. She does not look at them. She has learned not to look at them, because looking at them gives them what they want, which is a reaction, which is a story, which is a photograph that sells because it shows her. Acknowledging that she is being watched, she moves through the world with an expression that the press will spend years calling cold. It is not cold. It is the expression of someone managing something overwhelming, doing it with the only tool available: composure. Composure that was learned, that was practiced, that was, by this point so thoroughly built into the architecture of her days, that she could no longer tell, on certain mornings, where the performance ended and she began. She is, in 1996, one of the most photographed private citizens in the United States of America. Not a politician, not a movie star, not someone who had sought the camera or built a career that required it. A private person who married a public man and discovered, in the weeks after the wedding, that the public had decided she now belonged to them. She lives in a loft in Tribeca with her husband. She walks out the front door every morning, knowing they are waiting. She comes home every evening, knowing they will be there. She does this every day for 3 years. Most people who know the name Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy know the image, the wedding photograph, the street photographs, the photographs taken at events, where she stands beside John in something perfectly chosen, with an expression that gives nothing away. What almost nobody knows is who she actually was, where she came from, what she wanted from her life, before someone else's life became the container for it, what it felt like every morning to wake up inside a story that was not yours and had to be lived anyway. She died at 33 years old, in the passenger seat of a small plane her husband was piloting over the dark water off Martha's Vineyard on a hazy July evening. She had been married for 3 years. This is her story, not John's. Hers. Carolyn Jean Bessette was born on January 7, 1966, in White Plains, New York. She grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, one of the wealthiest communities in the wealthiest state in America. Greenwich in the 1970s was a world organized around certain assumptions about money, about appearance, about the relationship between the two that you absorbed before you were old enough to question them. The Bessette family was not the wealthiest family in Greenwich. Greenwich was full of wealthier families, but they were comfortable, the kind of comfortable that involves good schools and summer plans and the assumption that the future would be organized and manageable. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother and remarried a heart surgeon named Richard Freeman, and the family settled into the comfortable, organized world of the professional upper middle class, the world of good dinners and expectations, and the particular social code of New England that teaches you, before you can articulate it, exactly which things matter and exactly how they should be shown. She attended St. Mary's High School in Greenwich, a Catholic school, serious about academics, serious about the particular kind of young woman it was trying to produce. She was, by accounts of classmates and teachers, immediately distinguishable, not because she was the loudest, not because she performed, but because she had a quality that certain people carry from their earliest years, of being entirely themselves, in a world that spends most of its energy asking people to be someone else. She was popular in the way that people who are genuinely charismatic are popular, not through effort or calculation, but through the magnetic quality of someone who is paying full attention to whoever they happen to be talking to. She made people feel seen. This is, it turns out, one of the rarest gifts a person can have, and one of the most useful, in a world that is almost entirely organized around people feeling invisible. There are photographs of her from high school, not many because she was not famous then, but enough to see something. She is laughing in most of them, not the controlled, composed laugh of the woman the world would later make her, but an actual, physical laugh, the kind that takes over a face and doesn't ask permission. It is a reminder that the composure was not the original condition. The composure came later. The composure was learned. After high school, she enrolled at Boston University, studying education, which tells you something about who she was then and what she thought her life might become. Education, not fashion, not business, not law. She wanted to teach. She was drawn to the kind of work that required you to pay attention to people, to understand how they learned, what they needed, how to reach them. This is not the biography of a woman who was always headed for fashion. This is the biography of a woman who found fashion and discovered she was extraordinarily good at it, but who had underneath all of that something that the fashion world could not entirely contain. She moved through Boston with the ease of someone who has been raised to know how rooms work. She made friends. She had relationships. She built the ordinary architecture of a young woman's life in a new city. The apartment, the neighborhood, the coffee place, the friends who become family. She was, in these years, simply Carolyn Bessette. No camera, no legend attached. Just a young woman in Boston, figuring out what her life would be. After graduating from Boston University in 1988, she did something that surprised people who had known her in Greenwich. She got a job at a Lexus dealership, selling cars, not fashion, not media, not any of the glamorous worlds that her face and her bearing seemed designed for. She was good at it because she was good at people, at understanding what they wanted, at giving them the feeling that they had made a decision rather than been sold something. But something was pulling her south, toward New York, toward the world that was, even then, even from a distance, clearly the world she was built for. She moved to New York. She found the fashion industry, and the fashion industry found her. She started at Calvin Klein in the early 1990s, in the showroom, working directly with clients, managing the relationships between the house and the people who wore it. She was, from the beginning, in exactly the right place. Not because Calvin Klein was the most prestigious house, though it was. Not because the job was glamorous, though it was. But because Calvin Klein, in the early 1990s, was doing something with fashion that no one else was doing quite the same way. It was making an argument about what clothing could mean, about restraint, about the relationship between simplicity and power. And Carolyn understood that argument, instinctively in her bones, in the way she dressed, in the way she moved through rooms, in a way that made her not just an employee, but a living embodiment of everything the brand was trying to say. Calvin Klein in the early 1990s was the most interesting place in American fashion, not because of the clothes alone, though the clothes were extraordinary, but because of what Calvin Klein understood about the relationship between fashion and image, between clothing and identity, between what you wear and who you are allowed to be. The 1990s were a decade of minimalism, a reaction against the excess of the 1980s, the shoulder pads and the gold, the more is more logic that had defined the previous decade's visual language. Calvin Klein was the prophet of the correction. Less, cleaner, more austere. The idea that the body itself was enough, that clothing was a frame, not a statement, and that the power of a garment was in what it withheld as much as what it showed. Carolyn moved through this world with a facility that impressed everyone who watched her work. She started in client relations, which sounds modest, but was, in practice, one of the most demanding jobs in fashion. The clients were some of the most powerful, most difficult, most demanding people in New York: editors, celebrities, socialites, women who had opinions about everything and expected those opinions to be accommodated. Carolyn handled all of them, not by being deferential. She was not, by any account, deferential, but by being present, fully present, the kind of presence that makes someone feel they are being genuinely heard, genuinely considered, genuinely seen. She rose quickly. Within a few years, she was director of publicity, one of the most influential positions in one of the most influential fashion houses in America. She was in her mid to late 20s. She had built something entirely on her own intelligence, her own instincts, her own ability to move through complicated social worlds without losing herself in them. She had a career, an apartment, friends who would have walked through fire for her, a life that was, by any honest measurement, exactly what a young woman, with her gifts and her drive, was supposed to achieve. This is the part of her story that tends to get lost, buried under the Kennedy narrative, absorbed by the wedding photographs, and the paparazzi shots, and the myth that gets constructed around any woman who marries famous. But it matters, because it tells you that Carolyn Bessette was not someone who needed John Kennedy Jr. to give her a life. She had a life. She had built it herself. She had earned it. And then she fell in love with the most famous man in America, and the life she had built was replaced almost overnight by the story the world decided to tell about her. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was born on November 25, 1960. He was, from his first breath, perhaps the most famous child in America, born to a president, mourning that president at 3 years old, growing up under a scrutiny so complete and so relentless that it was simply the weather, the climate, the permanent condition of his existence. He had dealt with this, as people deal with the things they are born into, by finding a way to inhabit it that allowed him to also be a person. He became a lawyer. He founded George Magazine, a political lifestyle publication that was, in its way, an attempt to engage with the political world on his own terms rather than his father's. He flew planes. He kayaked. He ran. He moved through the world with the physical confidence of someone who has learned that the body is one place the cameras cannot entirely reach. He had also, and this is important for understanding what Carolyn found in him, a quality of genuine attention that his fame and his name made almost impossible to believe. He listened. He was curious. He asked questions and waited for the answers. In a world full of people who listened only enough to know when it was their turn to speak, John Kennedy Jr. was someone who actually wanted to know what you thought. They met at a Calvin Klein event in the early 1990s. The exact details have been reported slightly differently in different accounts, which is appropriate for a meeting that neither of them initially broadcast. What is consistent is this: they were introduced, they talked, and something happened that made them find each other again. They dated for 3 years before the engagement. 3 years that were, in the estimation of people who knew them both, who saw them in restaurants and at dinner parties, and in the ordinary moments of two people figuring out whether they wanted to build a life together. Some of the best years of Carolyn's life. She was still herself. The cameras hadn't fully found her. She was Carolyn Bessette, who happened to be in a relationship with John Kennedy Jr., rather than the thing she would later become. By 1994, the cameras had found her. Not completely. Not the way they would after the wedding. But enough. Enough that walking out of their building in Tribeca meant walking into a small crowd of men with cameras Enough that her photograph appeared in the tabloids regularly. Enough that people she had never met felt they had opinions about her. She was learning in real time what it meant to be adjacent to this particular fame. The Kennedy name was not like ordinary celebrity, not the celebrity of a movie star, or a musician, or a businessman. It was a national mythology, a grief story, a guilt story, a story about what America had lost, and what it had never quite recovered from. And Carolyn Bessette was now living inside that story, whether she wanted to or not. In February 1996, a photographer caught them arguing in Central Park. The photographs ran everywhere. John's face, animated and upset. The kind of expression that looks different on different people, depending on what the caption says. And Carolyn's face, which the press described as anguished, distraught, crying. She was crying, not performing crying, not the managed emotion of someone who has learned to grieve in public, actually crying in Central Park on a Sunday afternoon while someone photographed her from a calculated distance. The photographs sold enormously. The tabloids ran them with the breathless coverage reserved for royalty in crisis. The most famous couple in New York, in trouble, in public. Their private grief available for purchase at every newsstand in the country. This was the world she was deciding whether to fully enter. They stayed together. The relationship survived the photographs. The relationship survived a great deal, as relationships between two people who genuinely love each other tend to do. By spring 1996, they were planning a wedding. The plan required a level of secrecy that was, given who John was, almost unprecedented. They found Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island, accessible only by ferry, with no permanent residents, no hotels, no commercial infrastructure, a place where the press could not easily follow, and where the ceremony could be what they actually wanted it to be: private, theirs, real. On September 21, 1996, approximately 40 people made their way to Cumberland Island. 40 people for the wedding of the man whom every major publication in America had been following for 3 decades. The secrecy was extraordinary, maintained not through aggressive legal threats or complex operations, but through the simple mechanism of telling almost nobody. The ceremony was held at the First African Baptist Church, a small wooden building built in 1893 by freed slaves, on land that had been given to them by the Carnegie family. It held about 40 people, in wooden pews, by the light of candles that Carolyn had personally chosen. Outside, Spanish moss hung from live oaks that were older than anyone in the room. The Atlantic could be heard, if you were quiet enough to hear it. She wore a dress by Narciso Rodriguez, then a relatively unknown designer, a friend of Carolyn's, who had been given the commission and had made something extraordinary: a column of white silk crepe, bias cut, minimal, with a slit neckline, and a silhouette so clean that it looked like it had been drawn by someone who understood exactly what a body could do when you got out of its way. The dress was, in its way, a complete statement of who Carolyn Bessette was, or who she wanted to be. No ornamentation, no performance, no attempt to compete with the ceremony, the location, the name, the weight of the Kennedy mythology that was present in that church, as surely as any of the 40 guests. Just the dress, just her, just the choice to be simple. When everything around you is complicated, the photographs, taken by a single photographer, the couple had allowed, were released after the ceremony. The world saw them and lost its collective mind. Every magazine, every newspaper, every television entertainment program, every fashion column. The dress became, within weeks, one of the most copied wedding dresses in the history of American fashion. The couple was compared to royalty. The location was described as dreamlike. The secrecy was praised as romantic. The dress was analyzed by every fashion editor in the Western world. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, who had just that morning been Carolyn Bessette, woke up famous. Not the background famous of being the girlfriend of JFK Jr., the foreground famous, the subject of the story, the woman in the wedding photograph that the whole world was looking at. The Monday after the wedding, she walked out of the apartment in Tribeca. The photographers were not just waiting. There were more of them, many more, because now she was not just the woman who was dating John Kennedy Jr. She was the woman who had married him. She was Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. She was a Kennedy, and in the logic of the American press, in the logic that had governed every person who had ever been connected to that particular family, she now belonged to them. The Kennedy name was not ordinary fame. Movie stars were famous. Politicians were famous. Businessmen and musicians and athletes were famous. But the Kennedy name was something else. A national mythology. A grief story. A guilt story. A story about what America had done. And what it had never quite been able to forgive itself for. To marry into the Kennedy name was to marry into a story that had been running for 30 years. A story with its own logic, its own demands, its own cast of characters, all of whom had opinions about who belonged, and who the new addition was, and whether she was good enough. Carolyn had not grown up inside this story. She was not equipped with 30 years of practice at managing it. She arrived at the beginning of her marriage, and found that the wedding had not been the beginning. The story had been running long before her. She had simply entered it. The Kennedy family world was organized around a set of values and a set of expectations that were not always immediately visible. Physical toughness, public service, the performance of a particular kind of American ideal, vigorous, optimistic, forward-facing, that had been manufactured partly and believed partly, and had become, over 3 decades, indistinguishable from the real thing. Carolyn moved through this world with varying degrees of ease. She was not without social skills. She was one of the most socially skilled people in any room she entered. But the Kennedy world had its own specific code, its own history, its own insider references, its own particular way of testing people to see if they were genuinely part of the story or merely adjacent to it. John had a public identity that pre-existed her and continued alongside her. The magazine, the legal work, the public engagements, the speeches and appearances that came with the name. He moved through these worlds with the ease of someone who had been navigating them since before he could fully understand them. Carolyn was learning. She was learning in public. She was learning while being watched by everyone who had decided that her performance was either adequate or inadequate to the role she had accepted. And then there were the comparisons to Jackie. Jackie Kennedy Onassis had died in 1994, 2 years before Carolyn's wedding. She had become, in death, an even more powerful myth than she had been in life. The most elegant first lady, the most composed widow, the woman who had survived Dallas and everything that followed, with an impeccable, apparently inhuman grace. Carolyn was now measured against this myth. Every photograph, every public appearance, every outfit. Was she as elegant as Jackie? As composed? As appropriate? She was 30 years old, learning how to be a Kennedy wife, a role that had no job description, no training program, no predecessor who was available to advise her. Jackie Kennedy was dead, and the press was holding Carolyn up to Jackie Kennedy's ghost and asking why she didn't measure up. The marriage, by all accounts, of people who were genuinely close to both of them, was real, not a performance, not a transaction, not the arrangement that cynical people assume. When a beautiful woman marries a famous man, they loved each other. They were complicated together, which is what love actually looks like between two strong-willed, intelligent people who are both carrying things they haven't fully processed. They fought, sometimes publicly. The Central Park photographs had established that they disagreed about things that mattered and things that didn't. They navigated the ordinary difficulties of two people sharing a life. plus the extraordinary difficulties of doing it inside a fishbowl that neither of them had built, and neither of them could entirely dismantle. The press had decided, by 1997 and 1998, that Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy was unhappy, that the marriage was troubled, that she was difficult, icy, demanding, cold. These conclusions were drawn from photographs, from the expression she wore when walking through a wall of cameras, from the fact that she did not smile on command for the men with telephoto lenses who stationed themselves outside her building, the people who actually knew her, not the tabloids, not the photographers, not the people who had seen her on a street in Soho, but the people who had dinner with her, who called her when things went wrong, who knew her in the way that only the people you trust actually know you. Those people described someone entirely different from the press construction. Warm, wickedly funny, the kind of funny that requires genuine intelligence to sustain, loyal in the specific way of people who don't give their loyalty easily, but give it completely when they do, interested in the people around her, in a way that was not performative, the kind of interest that remembers the thing you mentioned 6 months ago and asks about it now. She had left Calvin Klein after the marriage, partly by choice, partly by circumstance, partly because the complications of being Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy and being director of publicity at one of the most scrutinized brands in fashion were too significant to manage simultaneously. The leaving meant that the world she had built, the career, the professional identity, the thing that was entirely and only hers, was gone. She was now primarily Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, the wife, the Kennedy wife, the woman in the photographs. This is not a small thing. Identity is not simply who you are on the inside. It is also what you do, how you spend your days, what you are building, and where you are going, and who you are in the world, independent of who you love. Carolyn had had that. She had built that. And then the marriage required her, in ways that were not entirely explicit, but were entirely real, to set it aside. She was trying to figure out what to replace it with. She was 31, 32 years old. She was trying to figure out what her life was going to be. Every morning, every single morning, she woke up in the apartment in Tribeca. She got dressed, and the getting dressed was not ordinary, because nothing about leaving the apartment was ordinary. Every choice she made would be photographed and analyzed and discussed in columns and ranked against what Jackie would have worn. She left the building. She walked into the light. The cameras were there. This happened every day for 3 years, without a break, without a day when the cameras weren't there, without a morning when she could walk out of her building and simply be Carolyn Bessette, the woman from Greenwich who was good at her job and had a life she had built herself, rather than Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, the Kennedy wife, the woman who had to be measured against a dead woman's ghost and could never quite win. People who have not experienced this level of sustained public scrutiny, and very few people have, tend to underestimate what it does. It is not simply unpleasant. It is disorienting. When you are watched constantly, you begin to watch yourself constantly, to see yourself through the camera's eye, to edit your movements and your expressions before they happen, to perform the performance of a natural person, rather than being one. This is what the photographs from the later years of her marriage show. If you know what you're looking for. Not unhappiness, exactly. Not coldness. Something more specific. The expression of someone who is managing something enormous with complete competence and who is very, very tired of managing it. Compare the photographs from September 1996, the wedding the first weeks after, with the photographs from 1998, 1999. The composure is the same. The elegance is the same. The surface is the same. But something in the eyes is different. Something that is not sadness, or not only sadness, but the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something for longer than they expected to carry it, and is not sure when they will be able to put it down. And then there was Martha's Vineyard. The Vineyard was where the Kennedy world had always retreated. Redgate Farm, the family property in Aquina. And it was, for Carolyn, a different experience of the life she was living. Away from the city, away from the daily machinery, on an island where the rules were different, where she could move through a day without the full weight of the name pressing down. She was learning to sail. She was cooking. She was, by all accounts, more relaxed on the Vineyard than she was anywhere else. The summer of 1999. John Kennedy Jr. was 38 years old. Carolyn was 33. They had been married for 3 years. By the accounts of people who saw them that summer, who ate dinner with them, who sailed with them, who knew them in the way that island summers allow for knowing they were in a better place than the press had been suggesting. Not perfect. Marriage between two strong people is never perfect, but better, more settled. The rawness of the first years, the adjustment, the loss of her professional identity, the grinding daily pressure of being watched and judged and measured, had begun gradually to become something she could live with, rather than something she was only surviving. There are photographs from that summer, the ones taken by friends, not by the paparazzi, in which she looks more at ease than she had looked in years, laughing at something, looking at the water, not performing anything for anyone, just there, just Carolyn, just a woman in her early 30s, spending a summer on an island she loved, with people she loved, trying to figure out what the next part of her life would look like. John was flying more that summer. He had obtained his pilot's license and had been building hours, the careful, methodical accumulation of flight time and experience that the licensing process required. He owned a Piper Saratoga, a single-engine aircraft, capable and well-regarded, and he had been flying it regularly, building confidence in the plane and in himself. Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's sister, a banker at Morgan Stanley, was going to a cousin's wedding on the Vineyard. She was flying with them. 3 people. A small plane. A July evening. A hazy sky over the Atlantic. On the evening of July 16, 1999, John filed a flight plan from Essex County Airport in New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. The weather briefing indicated haze, not formally dangerous conditions, within the parameters of what was permissible, but the kind of haze that experienced instrument pilots approach with caution. John was not yet fully instrument rated. He was rated for visual flight, which means flying by what you can see. In hazy conditions over dark water at night, what you can see is not always enough. The plane took off at 8:38 p.m. The flight to Martha's Vineyard should have taken approximately 40 minutes. At 9:39 p.m., the plane had not arrived. No radio contact had been established with Martha's Vineyard Airport. The search began. The search was one of the largest in recent maritime history. Coast Guard vessels, Navy ships, private boats, helicopters, 14 square miles of ocean, searched in the days that followed. Outside the apartment in Tribeca, flowers began to appear. Before there was confirmation, before there was certainty, because the people who left them there already knew. On July 21st, divers located the wreckage on the ocean floor, 116 feet below the surface, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded, after extensive investigation, that the probable cause was the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane due to spatial disorientation in conditions of reduced visibility. On July 22nd, John Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette were buried at sea. From the deck of the USS Briscoe, a Navy destroyer, near the location where the plane went down, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy was 33 years old. The world mourned, in the way that the world mourns Kennedy deaths, with a particular quality of grief that is partly personal and partly historical, partly about the people themselves, and partly about what they represented. John Kennedy Jr. was mourned as the end of something. the last of a certain kind of American mythology, the final chapter of Camelot. Carolyn was mourned as his wife, not primarily as herself, not as the woman from Greenwich, who had built a career at Calvin Klein, who had been direct and warm and funny, who had been trying, in the years of the marriage, to figure out how to live inside a name that didn't fit her, and a story she hadn't written. She was mourned as the woman beside John. Even in death, the cameras were more interested in him. Narciso Rodriguez, whose dress had made his career, became one of the most respected designers in American fashion.
He has spoken about Carolyn
with great care and great consistency, describing her as someone who is genuinely kind, genuinely interested in the work, genuinely not the cold, difficult person that the press had constructed. He has said she was one of his closest friends. He has said her death was the worst loss of his professional life. He has also, quietly, made the argument that the dress was hers, that it succeeded because of her, because of who she was, and what she brought to wearing it, not despite the woman, but entirely because of her. She has become, in the years since her death, an icon of 1990s style, referenced in fashion editorials, included in every list of the most stylish women of any recent decade, exhibited, analyzed, imitated. The irony, which is not subtle, is that she spent 3 years trying to escape the cameras, trying to be private, trying to be herself, rather than the image the cameras had made of her. And then she died at 33. And then the cameras made her immortal, the person she was trying to become, the woman who had figured out how to live inside this story on her own terms, who had found the professional identity to replace the one she had lost, who had made her peace with the name and the cameras and the Kennedy world. That person never arrived. She was 33 years old. She was still in the process of becoming her. The people who knew her do not primarily remember the image. They remember the laugh, which was loud, apparently louder than you'd expect from someone that composed. They remember the directness, the way she said exactly what she thought, without softening it for comfort, and the way she expected the same in return. They remember the loyalty, the way she showed up, fully, completely, for the people she loved, and the way she showed up, even when it cost her. She had wanted, in some version of her life, that she had not quite gotten to yet, that she was still building. In the summer of 1999, to work again, to have something that was hers, to be Carolyn Bessette, as well as Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. She was 33 years old. She had time.
She didn't get the time.
The plane went down on a July evening, over dark water. She was in the passenger seat. She was 33 years old. She had spent 3 years learning to live inside a story that was not hers, navigating a world that had decided who she was before she had a chance to decide herself, doing it with a grace and a composure that the world mistook for coldness, waiting for the version of the life that would be quieter, that would be more hers, that would let her be Carolyn Bessette again, as well as everything else. She was building toward that. She could feel it getting closer. She never got there. That is the story of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy.